In the brutal winter of 1944, a group of German women expected their capture by American forces to be the end. They braced for cruelty, punishment, anything. But what happened that night stunned them so deeply, many remembered it for the rest of their lives. Because the Americans who held them did something no one expected. Before we begin, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. This is a story every American should hear. The winter air along the western edge of Germany carried a sharpness that seemed to cut through cloth and bone alike. Snow had fallen earlier in the afternoon, thin, uneven patches scattered over churned mud and broken fence posts. By nightfall, the landscape had quieted into a cold hush, broken only by the distant rumble of American supply trucks rolling steadily toward the Rhine. For the first time in years, the sound of engines no longer meant fear for the locals. It meant the war, at least for this part of Germany, was slipping away. Along a narrow farm road just east of Aachen, a small column of prisoners marched under the dim glow of a single American lantern. These were not soldiers in field gray uniforms carrying rifles. These were women, German female auxiliaries, pulled from communication huts, field hospitals, and clerical posts, rounded up during the chaotic German retreat. Their hands were cold. Their boots were worn thin. They were exhausted beyond the point of dignity, but too frightened to complain. Most were barely in their 20s. A few were older. All carried the same expression, dread mixed with resignation. Behind them walked two American MPs, rifles slung casually across their shoulders, not pointed at anyone, not barked like threats. Their posture alone confused the women. For days they had been told that capture by Americans meant humiliation, starvation, worse. Nazi officers had painted a picture of a barbaric enemy, a ruthless army seeking revenge for every bomb dropped on London and every American life lost on the front. And yet, these guards looked bored. Professional. Almost gentle. As the group approached a low, weathered barn on the crest of a small hill, one of the women whispered, "They will separate us now." Another shivered and murmured, "They will punish us." A third, her voice trembling, said only, "Just don't look them in the eyes. They hate us." But the American sergeant walking ahead did nothing of the sort. He pushed open the barn door, letting a pool of warm yellow lantern light spill across the snow, and motioned for them to enter with a simple wave, no shouting, no threats, no rush. Inside, the women found bales of hay arranged into makeshift bedding. Blankets, rough, army-issued, but undeniably clean, were stacked neatly in one corner. They exchanged confused glances. In Germany at this stage of the war, even civilians rarely saw blankets that weren't moth-eaten scraps. The sergeant spoke briefly to his men, though the women couldn't understand the English. What mattered was his tone, calm, matter-of-fact, as though nothing about the situation required harshness. The MPs stepped back outside, leaving the lantern burning. The women froze. They waited for an order that never came. In Germany, an unguarded POW, even one who was a woman, would never exist. A camp without a shouting officer? Impossible. The very idea contradicted everything they had been taught. But the Americans stepped away from the barn entirely, their silhouettes shrinking into the snowy darkness as they walked toward a small command post down the hill. No guard was left at the door. No lock was placed on the outside. No chain. No shouted warning. The prisoners stood motionless, unsure whether this was a trick or a moment of negligence they were expected to exploit. One woman, thin, her cheeks hollow from rationing, pressed her palm to her mouth. "This cannot be right," she whispered. "The Americans are careless." Another shook her head. "No. They're certain we won't run." And that was the truth beneath the surface. The Americans didn't guard them because they didn't need to. They controlled the roads. The towns. The skies above. German defenses were collapsing, and everybody knew it, including the women inside the barn. As the lantern flickered, the prisoners slowly settled onto the hay, each one listening for footsteps, a key turning, anything to confirm that danger was still close. But all they heard was the distant hum of American trucks, the quiet rustle of blankets, and the unsettling realization that the enemy they had feared for so long was acting with a restraint their own superiors rarely showed. And that single moment, confusing, quiet, and unforgettable, would mark the beginning of a night none of them would ever forget. The night when the Americans simply walked away. A night that would shape everything that came next. By the final months of 1944, Germany's entire war structure was unraveling, and with it came a growing reliance on women to fill roles once reserved for trained soldiers. Most Americans today remember the era through iconic photographs, Hitler Youth drilling with wooden rifles, factory workers welding tank armor, and grim-faced German officers poring over maps. But behind these scenes stood thousands of women whose contributions, though crucial, placed them dangerously close to the collapsing front. These women served as Nachrichtenhelferin, communications auxiliaries. Others worked as radio operators, telephone switchboard attendants, medical clerks, typists, map readers, convoy support, and field hospital assistants. They didn't fire rifles or storm trenches, but they lived in the orbit of war every day, absorbing its pressure, its ideology, and its consequences. From the beginning, the Third Reich fed them a very particular story. America was the enemy, and Americans were merciless. German propaganda, especially during the last year of the war, intensified its warnings. Leaflets, speeches, and radio broadcasts claimed that American troops were lawless invaders who would punish any German who surrendered. Women were told they would face humiliation or worse. Officers stressed that capture was more frightening than battle itself. Few questioned these warnings. Dissent was dangerous, and most had never seen an American in person. Their understanding of the outside world came from speeches and censored newspapers, sources that insisted Germany still had a chance, that loyalty meant survival, and that surrender meant disgrace. So when Allied forces punched through the Siegfried Line and poured into Western Germany, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. For many women in the German auxiliary branches, the front line suddenly appeared at their doorstep. Communications bunkers were abandoned. Field hospitals were overrun. Units intended to be rear support suddenly found themselves face-to-face with advancing American divisions. Many of these women were caught in chaotic retreats, columns of soldiers rushing east under fire, vehicles breaking down, units scattering in confusion. Some auxiliaries tried to follow their commanding officers. Others hid in farmhouses or barns, hoping to avoid detection entirely. But American patrols, moving swiftly and methodically, found them. Here is where the stark contrast began. The Germans expected rage. The Americans displayed procedure. The Germans expected revenge. The Americans followed regulations. The Germans expected cruelty. The Americans offered calm. This wasn't softness. It was strength built on supply superiority, training, and discipline. While German soldiers were starving, American units moved forward with full rations, warm clothing, spare boots, medical supplies, and a logistical network unlike anything the European theater had ever seen. When U.S. forces captured prisoners, male or female, they handled them with efficiency, not malice. They had no emotional need to inflict suffering. They were winning decisively, and they knew it. In the eyes of German women raised on years of warnings, this behavior felt impossible. Everything they had been told collided sharply with the reality in front of them. Some of the auxiliaries, especially the younger ones, couldn't understand the Americans' confidence. They didn't realize that U.S. units received thorough training in the Geneva Convention, that American MPs were instructed to maintain order without brutality, and that these systems remained intact even under the immense pressures of wartime. Most importantly, the women didn't know how Americans viewed them. To American soldiers, these auxiliaries weren't threats. They weren't combatants. They weren't the enemy officers responsible for atrocities or battlefield decisions. They were simply people caught in a war that was ending in the only way it could, with the United States and its allies pushing relentlessly through Germany's western defenses. This difference in perception changed everything. When the German women were finally marched into American custody, they were terrified. Their fear didn't come from any immediate threat. It came from the weight of years of propaganda telling them to expect the worst. But instead of cruelty, they encountered a machine of overwhelming order, American soldiers moving with a mixture of confidence and exhaustion, but never malice. Trucks rolled with mechanical steadiness. MPs issued clear instructions. No one screamed. No one struck them. No one treated them as trophies of war. It created a moment of dissonance so profound that some of the prisoners felt dizzy with confusion. Their world, built on warnings of barbaric American invaders, wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing entirely. And that collapse became even more powerful when they reached the place where they would spend the night, a place where American behavior defied every expectation they still held. A place where their fear would meet an even more unsettling reality. The Americans simply didn't bother guarding them. To understand why the Americans treated their prisoners with such quiet confidence, one must look closely at the overwhelming superiority the United States held by late 1944. Not just in firepower. Not just in numbers. But in discipline, logistics, and a system of military professionalism unmatched anywhere in the European theater. For many older Americans who lived through the war era, these differences remain vivid in memory. The United States didn't simply fight Germany, it outproduced, outsupplied, and outorganized it on every level. The women captured near Aachen had grown up hearing that Germany was the pinnacle of order and efficiency. But by the last year of the war, that image was a hollow shell. Roads were clogged with refugees. Ammunition was scarce. Uniforms were patched so many times they barely held together. Rations grew thinner each month. Meanwhile, the Americans moved like a nation built on abundance. Every truck was full. Every man had boots that fit. Every squad carried more food than a German platoon would see in a week. Most importantly, American soldiers didn't rely on desperation to fuel their discipline. Their power came from structure, clear training, defined responsibilities, and a belief that order and restraint demonstrated strength, not weakness. When U.S. forces advanced into Germany, they did so as a machine built to win cleanly and quickly. For the German women being transported into custody, this power radiated from every detail. The boots on the MPs' feet looked nearly new. Their uniforms were clean despite long marches. Their weapons were slung casually, not clutched in fear. The trucks that passed the prisoners on the road had tailgates loaded with crates, ammunition, medical supplies, hot rations, and spare clothing. Even the smell of gasoline, coffee, and oiled metal drifting through the evening air spoke of a force that suffered no shortages. To those auxiliaries, the sensory contrast was staggering. In their service huts and communications bunkers, they had endured months of dwindling supplies, fewer gloves, fewer blankets, less soap, less everything. Even German officers were running short on basics. Yet here were the Americans, steady, clean, alert, and carrying themselves with the unshakable posture of men who knew the war was tilting entirely in their favor. This superiority wasn't just logistical. It was psychological. American soldiers, even when tired, projected an attitude that said, "We are in control. We are not afraid. And we do not need to mistreat you." That simple truth shattered years of German propaganda. In the Reich, fear was a tool. Discipline often meant shouting, threats, and punishment. Officers demanded absolute obedience. The idea that a guard might trust a prisoner, even slightly, was absurd. But to American MPs, guarding women who posed little risk was a waste of manpower. The front needed strength. Supply convoys needed escorts. Bridges needed protection. No one wanted to assign a fully armed squad to stand outside a barn where 20 exhausted female auxiliaries, cold, hungry, and terrified, were trying to rest. So the Americans did something the Germans would never have done. They relied on common sense. These women had nowhere to run. The front was swallowed in darkness, snow, and American patrols covering every road. Any escape attempt would end in the same place, another U.S. checkpoint. And the women knew it. To the Americans, guarding them heavily wasn't efficient. To the German women, not being guarded at all was unthinkable. What the Germans interpreted as carelessness was, in truth, the purest expression of dominance. When a force is losing, it guards everything obsessively: food, equipment, prisoners, even rumors. When a force is winning, it guards only what matters. This distinction became crystal clear as the women sat inside the barn that night, blankets in their hands, the lantern flickering softly. Each of them wrestled with the same realization: the Americans weren't acting without discipline. They were acting with a level of discipline Germany could no longer maintain. And from that superior discipline came a quiet, confident power, one stronger than intimidation and more believable than propaganda. The women felt it. They feared it. And slowly, they began to understand it. That understanding would deepen even more when the first night in captivity unfolded, a night where American confidence revealed itself in the most unexpected way of all. A night that none of them would ever forget. The barn sat alone on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, dark wooden boards weathered by decades of German winters, its high roof curved like an old soldier's back. Inside, the lantern flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows over the bales of hay arranged as bedding. The German women stood silently, unsure if they were allowed to sit, to speak, or even to breathe normally. Outside, the cold deepened. A thin crust of frost began to settle over the ground, sparkling under the moonlight. The soft rumble of American trucks on the distant road seemed strangely comforting in the stillness, as though the war itself had stepped back for a moment. The women exchanged nervous glances. "What are they waiting for?" one whispered. "Guards," another replied, her voice brittle. "They must be posting guards." But no guards arrived. At first, the women assumed the Americans were simply late. Perhaps the MPs were discussing where to position themselves. Perhaps they were fetching more men. Perhaps the sergeant had given the order and they were still organizing. Several minutes passed, then several more. Still nothing. The atmosphere inside the barn grew heavy. Some of the prisoners wrapped blankets around their shoulders, but the warmth didn't reach their hands. Their nerves were too tight, their fears too sharp. The weight of uncertainty pressed on each of them. Then, finally, footsteps approached. The door creaked open, letting in a wave of icy air. 2 American MPs stood in the entryway. The women quickly straightened, expecting instructions. Orders. Demands. Something forceful. Instead, one of the MPs lifted the lantern, glanced across the room with a nod of approval, and simply said something the women couldn't quite understand. But his tone was unmistakable, calm, routine, almost casual. He then pointed to the blankets, then to the floor, making a clear motion, sleep. They stared at him, paralyzed. The MP waited a moment, shrugged lightly, closed the barn door, and walked away. That was it. No guard remained at the entrance. No one locked the door from the outside. No one shouted warnings or issued threats. For the first time since the war began for them, the women were completely unmonitored by anyone in uniform. It was the kind of moment that broke long-held beliefs in an instant. One young auxiliary, barely 19, began to cry quietly, not from fear, but from the sheer confusion that came with being treated like a human being instead of a disposable tool of the Reich. Another woman, older and hardened by years of propaganda, whispered shakily, "This is impossible. They want us to run." But they all knew that wasn't true. Running made no sense. The entire region was crawling with American patrols. German forces had either retreated east or surrendered. There were no friendly lines left to reach. And even if there were, most of the women didn't have the strength to walk a mile without collapsing. Still, their minds raced. Why would an enemy they had been taught to fear, allow them to sleep unguarded? The answer, though none of them could admit it yet, had been forming since their capture. The Americans were not afraid of them. To these women, raised under a government built on control and intimidation, the absence of guards felt more threatening than the presence of them. It told them everything about the state of the war. Germany was no longer feared. Germany was no longer respected. Germany was no longer even considered a danger. And they, who had served the collapsing war machine, were now seen merely as tired, harmless prisoners needing rest. Inside the barn, the minutes stretched into an hour. Eventually, the women laid down on the hay, blankets pulled tightly around their bodies. Some tried to sleep. Most could not. The weight of silence pressed upon them. Outside, American soldiers laughed around a small fire near their tents, relaxed, confident, unaffected by the presence of the prisoners. Their voices drifted through the quiet, a reminder that to the Americans, this night was simply another step toward victory. For the women, it was the night everything they believed about the enemy fractured. No guards. No threats. No cruelty. Just a lantern, a barn, and a night they would remember for the rest of their lives, because it revealed a truth more powerful than any battlefield victory. America didn't need fear to control its enemies. It had already won. When the barn finally settled into silence, it wasn't comfort that filled the room, it was disbelief. The women lay wrapped in their blankets, staring upward into the shadows where the lantern light faded into darkness. Every creak of the wooden beams, every shift of hay beneath their bodies, every gust of wind outside felt amplified against the tension humming inside the enclosure. None of them could sleep. Not really. Not tonight. For years they had been told the Americans were savages, men who would show no mercy to a captured German, especially a woman in uniform, even if the uniform only marked her as an auxiliary clerk or radio operator. They expected interrogation, humiliation, harsh discipline. Some had silently prepared themselves for the worst. Instead, the Americans had given them blankets. They had allowed them to lie down. They had spoken without anger. And then, most impossible of all, they had walked away. This simple act unsettled the women more than any shouted order could have. Punishment was predictable. Fear was familiar. But this quiet, almost indifferent treatment, was something they had no defense against. A woman near the back of the barn shivered, not from cold, but from confusion. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Why would they leave us like this? Why would they trust us?" Her neighbor, a telephone operator from Cologne, shook her head slowly. "It's not trust," she murmured. "It's something else." But she couldn't find the right word. The truth was, none of them could. From the far corner, another voice spoke, a medic in her 30s who had seen the war chew through young men year after year. "They don't care if we escape," she said. "Because there is nowhere to go." Her statement carried no malice, only a weary honesty. The others knew she was right. The roads were controlled by Americans. Bridges, checkpoints, crossroads, all under U.S. command. Towns had fallen one after another. Even the countryside, once considered safe, was crawling with Allied patrols sweeping for stragglers. If a woman somehow managed to slip away, she would last maybe a day. 2 at most. That understanding planted a deeper seed in their minds. The Americans weren't careless. They were completely in control. As the lantern burned lower, a few of the younger auxiliaries quietly wept, not from terror, but from the overwhelming realization that everything they had been taught about the barbaric American enemy was crumbling. Years of fear had shaped their expectations. The Reich had warned them repeatedly, "The Americans will show no mercy. The Americans hate you. The Americans are monsters. Yet here they were, lying in a warm barn, unguarded, unthreatened, untouched. One girl, barely 18, her face still carrying traces of adolescence, spoke up through her tears. If our officers lied about this, she whispered, what else wasn't true? No one answered. But the silence itself was an answer. For the older women, those who had lived under the Nazi system long enough to understand its ways, the shock ran even deeper. They remembered how German officers treated their own subordinates, barking orders, enforcing curfews, demanding obedience under threat of punishment. Even within their own ranks, fear was a tool of command. To see American soldiers behave without fear, without cruelty, without the need to dominate, this was a kind of strength they had never witnessed before. A strength rooted not in desperation but in certainty. The war, for the Americans, was not slipping away or turning hopeless. It was steadily, methodically being won. Their patience, their restraint, their calm treatment of prisoners were all reflections of an army confident in its superiority. The barn door remained shut but unguarded, the cold wind occasionally slipping through the cracks. And every time the breeze touched their skin, the women were reminded of the reality outside: American voices, American trucks, American control over a land that had once been theirs. Several women huddled together for warmth, whispering quietly about home, parents, younger siblings, empty apartments left behind in bombed cities. And beneath all of it, a single shared thought settled slowly among them. If this is how the enemy treats us, then maybe the war truly is over. Maybe not on paper, not officially, not yet. But in their hearts, in their minds, in the quiet of that long night, something surrendered. The barn was more than a shelter. It was a turning point. A place where illusions died, where fear loosened its grip, and where an unexpected truth rose from the silence. The Americans were not the monsters they had been warned about. They were the victors, calm, confident, and powerful enough to show mercy without fear. And by morning, that truth would become undeniable. Morning crept into the barn slowly, the pale winter light pushing through cracks in the wooden boards and spreading across the hay-covered floor. The lantern had burned itself out hours earlier, leaving behind a faint smell of smoke and warm metal. Most of the women had not slept more than a few minutes. Their bodies were exhausted, but their minds had refused rest. The first sound that broke the silence was not boots, not weapons, not shouted orders. It was laughter. American laughter. Friendly, unguarded, effortless. Outside, a few soldiers were gathered near the makeshift command post, sharing breakfast rations and talking as though nothing unusual had occurred. Their voices floated into the barn, creating a strange contrast with the fear and uncertainty that had filled the night. One woman sat up, rubbing her eyes. "They are talking," she whispered, puzzled. Another replied softly, "They sound as if they are on holiday." A third added, "Do they not care about us at all?" But of course the Americans cared, they simply weren't worried. A moment later, the barn door opened. The hinges groaned, and a wave of cold air swept inside. The women tensed instantly, instinctively bracing themselves. But the American MP who entered didn't look like someone preparing to discipline prisoners. He carried a metal container in one hand and a sack in the other. Behind him, another soldier carried a crate stamped U.S. rations, breakfast. The MP set the container down with a soft clang and then spoke in a tone that was unmistakably casual, almost cordial. The women didn't understand every word, but they understood the gesture as he pointed to the food, then to them. They blinked, stunned. Food. Warm food. The kind they hadn't seen in months: oatmeal, sweetened slightly with army sugar, bread that wasn't stale, steaming coffee that filled the barn with a rich aroma foreign to wartime Germany. One woman covered her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes. "Coffee," she whispered. "Real coffee." The Americans noticed their hesitation. Most of the prisoners were too shocked to approach. So one MP stepped forward and gently motioned again. "Eat." Slowly, cautiously, the women rose. Their bodies ached from anxiety, but hunger pushed them forward. As they took the food, the Americans stepped aside but did not supervise closely. They seemed more concerned with their own schedules than with controlling the prisoners. Then something happened, something that would stay etched in the women's memories for decades. An MP, perhaps amused by their surprise, shrugged with a half-smile and said something simple, almost jokingly reassuring. "You all looked like you needed sleep more than guards." The women didn't understand every word, but they caught the meaning. And it hit them like a revelation. The Americans had not guarded them because they didn't fear them. They didn't hate them. They simply saw them as tired human beings. To German ears, trained under years of rigid discipline and suspicion, this casual confidence was unbelievable. Everything about the Americans seemed to defy their expectations. Where German soldiers operated on threat and punishment, the Americans operated on systems and certainty. Where German officers demanded harsh obedience, American MPs relied on common sense and clear procedures. Where German propaganda promised violence, the Americans offered warm food and a calm morning. It was not kindness alone, it was confidence. A confidence born from victory. A confidence born from discipline. A confidence born from the knowledge that the war had already turned irreversibly in their favor. Outside the barn, the world reminded them of this truth. American convoys rolled across the road with steady purpose. Engineers worked on repairing bridges. Medics tended to wounded soldiers with quiet efficiency. Airplanes rumbled faintly in the distance, a sound that now belonged to the Allies alone. Every sight, every sound, every casual gesture of American normalcy reinforced the same reality. The United States no longer saw these women as a threat. And that realization shook the prisoners more deeply than anger or punishment ever could. As they ate their breakfast, several women exchanged glances, soft, weary, resigned. Yesterday, they had been German auxiliaries trained to support a military machine that was collapsing faster than anyone dared admit. Today, they were prisoners awakening to the truth that the enemy they feared was, in reality, more humane than the government they served. It was a moment of clarity, quiet, unexpected, and profoundly unsettling. And it marked the point when their perception of America shifted forever. When the war finally ended in May of 1945, the German women who spent that unforgettable night in the American barn scattered across a country now scarred beyond recognition. Cities they once knew were flattened. Train stations were shattered skeletons of steel. Homes were burned out or abandoned. Families were separated by borders, rubble, and the consequences of a regime that had promised victory but delivered only ruin. Yet, as these women returned to civilian life, some walking for days, some hitching rides with Allied convoys, some waiting for transport arranged by the occupying forces, many carried with them a memory so strange, so unexpected, that they struggled to speak of it at first. The night the Americans let them sleep without guards. For some, it lingered as a moment of mercy. For others, a moment of humiliation, an undeniable sign of defeat. For almost all of them, it became a point of comparison that reshaped how they viewed the entire war. In post-war years, as Europe tried to rebuild and reconcile, researchers, historians, and interviewers began collecting testimonies from civilians, auxiliary personnel, and former prisoners. And through these interviews, patterns emerged, quiet acknowledgments from women who had once served the Reich, but who now lived in a world where truth could no longer be punished. One testimony came from a former communications clerk who had been captured near Aachen in late 1944. In an interview given decades later, she recalled, "I expected anger. Instead, they acted as if we were simply tired travelers who needed rest. It was the first time I understood how badly we had been deceived." Another woman, a medic who had worked in a field hospital near the front, described her shock in a post-war letter archived in a Munich museum. "The Americans did not shout. They did not threaten. When I realized there were no guards at the door, I did not feel free. I felt defeated. But I also felt relief. I knew then the fighting was truly over for us." A former map assistant, captured with the same group, later told a British journalist that the unguarded night remained one of the most vivid memories of the war. She had carried a deep fear of American cruelty, fear built on propaganda, rumor, and years of indoctrination. "The moment I saw they were not watching us," she said, "I knew everything we had been told about them was a lie." What surprised historians most was how consistent these accounts were. Women captured in different regions, different units, different months, many reported similar experiences. The Americans, especially when handling small groups of female auxiliaries, showed a degree of restraint and procedural calm that contrasted sharply with the brutality happening elsewhere in Europe. Of course, war is never simple, and treatment varied from unit to unit. But over and over, the same sentiment appeared. The Americans behaved with a discipline and humanity the German women had not expected from any enemy, least of all from a nation their government had demonized for years. Many of these women returned home changed. Some questioned the ideology they had once supported without hesitation. Others struggled with guilt for believing the propaganda. A few even carried quiet admiration for the Americans, not for their firepower or their aircraft, but for the simple, grounded confidence shown in moments like that night in the barn. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself and the Cold War reshaped Europe, former prisoners often shared this story with their children and grandchildren, but rarely with pride. It was usually spoken softly, as a reflection of how wrong their expectations had been, and how deeply the war had distorted truth. For older American listeners, these accounts offer something important, a reminder that victory in World War II wasn't defined solely by battles or strategy. It was defined by character. By the way American soldiers held themselves. By the discipline they maintained even when exhaustion, grief, and loss could have easily justified cruelty. The unguarded night became, in its own understated way, a symbol of that character. A moment when the United States showed that dominance didn't need brutality, that strength didn't require fear, and that the quiet confidence of a winning army could leave a mark more lasting than any weapon. By the time the women reached their homes, wherever those homes still stood, they carried a truth they couldn't unlearn. The Americans had treated them better than their own country had taught them to expect. And that realization followed them for the rest of their lives. In the long arc of history, wars are often remembered for the battles, the thunder of artillery, the roar of airplanes, the marches across ruined cities. But for the men and women who lived through those years, it was often the quiet moments that stayed with them. The unexpected gestures. The pauses between violence. The rare glimpses of humanity in a world drowning in conflict. For the German women taken prisoner near Aachen, their most enduring memory was not a firefight or an air raid. It was a simple night in an old wooden barn, cold, dimly lit, unguarded. A night when they expected cruelty and received rest instead. A night when the enemy they had feared for years treated them not as threats, not as trophies of war, but simply as human beings who needed sleep. To many of them, that single night shattered more illusions than months of propaganda ever built. It forced them to reckon with a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. The Americans did not win the war through hatred. They won it through discipline, restraint, and a confidence rooted in who they were as a nation. For the United States, victory in Europe was not only a military achievement, it was a moral one. Even in exhaustion, even in loss, even as the fighting dragged on, American soldiers held to standards that set them apart. They didn't need to break prisoners to feel powerful. They didn't need cruelty to prove dominance. Their strength came from knowing the war was turning because of the values they carried with them. And so, in the quiet of that winter night, the German prisoners experienced something they had never expected. A moment of peace delivered by the very men they had been told to fear. For older Americans looking back on that era, these stories serve as reminders, not of triumph alone, but of character. They remind us that how we win matters just as deeply as the fact that we won. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a nation can do is simply walk away, lower its guard, and let the world see the difference between tyranny and freedom.